Do not trust him.
Whoa, where's this coming from?
It's coming from you back on the ship saying, trust me, we're professionals. We'll stick to the plan. We can do this. And then, that.
An overwhelmingly negative response to the game when it was
697 peak concurrent players.
It was dead on arrival.
Concord is effectively closing down.
Sony have shut down Concord developer Firewalk Studios.
That was not the plan.
Technically, it was a plan, it just wasn't the same plan that we started with.
Well, these Guardians of the Galaxy cosplayers were right about one thing. None of this was part of the plan for Concord. Sony clearly had high hopes for their big-budget hero shooter. While details were revealed late, the credentials of the design team, not to mention the flashy presentation and huge investment, positioned this as a flagship new title, one to bolster Sony's live service push. Instead, Concord became one of the most notorious flops in modern gaming. You probably witnessed it in real time, the brief but intense whirlwind of negative reception in the face of overwhelming mediocrity, with player counts lower than a limbo bar below sea level. Like its namesake, Concord aimed high, but unlike that distinctive commercial airliner, its lifespan wasn't as long or successful, crashing and burning just 2 weeks after it launched, then taken offline, never to return. Concord was quite literally outlived by a fruit fly, a bouquet of flowers, and a particularly resilient iceberg lettuce. But now some of the dust has settled, was it really that bad? Yes, it launched into an oversaturated market of generic hero shooters and live service slop, but at least it showed some solid shooter foundations made by a team of FPS veterans. So why did this game suffer so badly compared to so many objectively worse titles? Is the cost of being average to the point of forgettable actually more damaging than being notoriously bad? And what made it so middle of the road that nobody even wanted to play it? Was it the astronomical cost of development, a reported number which increases with every passing week, or the alleged studio culture of toxic positivity? And did any of this justify giving up so soon and shutting down a studio of 150 developers mere weeks after launch and only 1 year after being acquired by Sony in the first place? As you can see, there's a lot of baggage on board this Concord. I'm Ben from TripleJump, and we're here to work out what went wrong with Concord. First, let's cover the timeline of events leading up to this disastrously short-lived endeavor. Many reports say that Concord began development a whopping 8 years ago, back in 2016. That's been the prevailing narrative, but that can be misleading, not least because the developers of Concord, Firewalk Studios, was only founded in 2018, 2 years later. Makes perfect sense. Well, 2016 was when their parent company, probably Monsters Inc., was founded by former Bungie president Harold Ryan, so the initial concepting and very early pre-production ideas could well have begun here. But realistically, actual development probably didn't begin until quite a few years later. 2016 was also when 2 very important titles were at the peak of their powers. Overwatch, the iconic hero shooter, and Destiny, the live service money printer that every publisher CEO envied. Both hugely successful titles inspired entire subgenres of copycats, and both were destined, pun intended, to leave their mark on Concord's design. By 2018, Firewalk was officially founded, featuring more Bungie and Activision veterans who worked on Destiny, along with talent whose CVs featured Call of Duty, Mass Effect, Apex Legends, and more. Fast forward to 2021, by which point Firewalk probably were getting stuck into full development, and this is where Sony officially enters the picture, signing a publishing partnership for a new, original multiplayer IP, letting them contribute their vast expertise and budget to the mix. The following year was even bigger for Sony. In 2022, they acquired Bungie for $3.7 billion and announced their strategy to focus hard on live service games, planning around 12 before March 2026. Ugh. This left many fans scratching their heads, given the strength of Sony's premium single-player catalog and the extremely high fail rate of other live service attempts. Why pivot to a much riskier approach when their current plan was working fine? By the end of 2023, Sony backtracked their live service ambitions somewhat and ended up cancelling the long-promised The Last of Us Factions multiplayer spin-off. Alexa, define foreshadowing.
Foreshadowing. To expect 4 times the amount of shadow.
Thank you, Alexa. But amongst all of this, Sony still pulled out their wallet to outright buy Firewalk Studios and dropped a vague yet intriguing teaser trailer for Concord. It wouldn't be until the 30th of May 2024 during a state of play that we'd finally get the big reveal of this mysterious Concord. Oh, and a glimpse at the first red flags. You know what they say about first impressions? You only get one shot at them, and Concord undoubtedly fumbled theirs. We know how these modern game showcases go, and the sort of nuanced reactions they typically provoke. Live chats and social media feeds overrun with comments like boring, skip, L, where is Silksong, and so on. But even after the dust had settled, the extended reveal trailer was objectively not great. First, the pre-release marketing push was almost non-existent, and the 2023 teaser revealed absolutely nothing. Aside from the knowledge of the FPS pedigree of the devs, most went into the 2024 state of play none the wiser. At first glance, the full reveal trailer showed promise, a well-polished, high-budget cinematic possibly setting up another AAA single-player Sony special. And then the cast opened their mouths. The quip-heavy marvelization of every single character, even the bloody robot, the quote-unquote quirky gimmicks like the hot sauce, the overall designs and mannerisms being heavily derivative, well, that immediately put off a lot of people already fatigued by years of hokey Hollywood writing. See also 2023's Forspoken for similar complaints. Somehow, Concord succeeded in looking extremely high budget and feeling pretty low budget all at once. However, we understand these are quite subjective views. This style has been popularized for a reason, because it works. And besides, how bad could a light-hearted sci-fi romp with whimsical characters be? There's clearly effort put into the narrative, so with a good setup and intriguing world, we'd at least give it a go. Oh, good. It's a 5v5 competitive shooter. With live service elements, you say? Oh, of course it is. At best, this was a confusing swerve into a completely different game from what was implied with the cinematic, from something that could have been a co-op heist sim, or maybe an extraction shooter. Even Star-Lord, Yondu, no, it's a Lennox. Right. Even he literally mentions an extraction point. The messaging was completely out of sync, like the cinematic team hadn't spoken to the gameplay team at all. Our cynical side would see this as just another games-as-a-service cash grab, designed to drain your time and wallet for a few months before retiring to the dumpster heap with the rest of the failed live services. Never mind that the hero shooter shtick was well past its sell-by date too. Now, is this a completely fair assessment of the general audience sentiment? Not every live service fails. In fact, Sony struck gold just a few months prior to Concord's reveal with Helldivers 2. This bug-stomping, robot-dismantling democracy simulator hit an all-time peak player count of 458,000 just on Steam alone, and saw a resurgence of players as recently as September 2024. There's still clearly a market for games with live service elements, so long as they keep things fresh, fun, and crucially, don't take the piss. So, Concord had a chance at doing similar numbers, right? Sure? On the 18th of July, 2 months after the reveal trailer and just 1 month before release, Concord began its open beta, allowing anyone to sign up and play free of charge, no pre-order required. How many people played this beta? Concurrent players peaked at just 2,388 people on Steam. Wow. Even without context, you'll probably guess that is not a lot. For comparison, Valorant's closed beta scored 3 million players per day in 2020, and Overwatch pulled in 10 million players during their open beta from 2016. These aren't like-for-like stats, but from those figures you can safely assume highest player count at any given time was more than 2,000. Bear in mind, this free beta was the cheapest Concord would ever be, as Sony set the official launch price to $40, another huge oopsie in a crowded market of free-to-play shooters. Only 2,000 Steam users at one time bothered to show up for a free preview of Sony's latest big blockbuster. No set figures for PS5 have been published, but there was one strange PlayStation stat. Days before the open beta, an early access closed beta was provided for press and pre-orders, which later opened up to anyone on PS Plus. And strangely, this restricted first beta saw 8% more PS5 players than when it was open for all. When Concord launched properly on the 23rd of August, things somehow got even worse. Player count peaked at just 697 concurrent users within 24 hours and dipped hard after that. 697! One analyst, Simon Carlos, who runs the GameDiscover.co industry newsletter, estimated that total sales sat around 10,000 for Steam and 15,000 for PlayStation. And based on that player count, even those dismal sales numbers seem optimistic. Maybe it was an influx of birthday gifts for disappointed kids who probably would have preferred Redfall or Babylon's Fall, perhaps Lord of the Rings Gollum? All three of which still hit a higher peak player count than Concord, by the way. Yes, even Gollum. All this told us one thing about Concord's reception from the public. Apathy. A pure, unfiltered lack of caring, less than zero flips to give. Rarely, if ever, has a reasonably high-profile game, even an infamously bad stinker, performed worse than this, and never one with this sort of budget. Infinitely more people were watching news stories unfold about this disaster than there were people playing it. It's a little wonder that only 14 days later, on the 6th of September, Concord was taken down with just 52 players left on its final day. But what exactly did the game do so wrong to be so comprehensively ignored? Let's forget about the surrounding narrative for a moment and take a magnifying glass to the actual game itself to see what worked and what didn't. And this is where things get strange, because on the surface, Concord wasn't necessarily awful from a technical standpoint. There are plenty of flaws, but trust us, we know when a game is worse than most, and this felt more middle of the road than utter car crash. First, the good points. The Halo and Destiny pedigree is clear to see because the core shooting mechanics were on point. Gunplay was satisfying, responsive, and weighty where it should be. Hero abilities and variety was also not nearly as bad as it seemed either, with some interesting twists. One character named Itz could throw a magic bouncing ball and teleport to that point for some tricksy flanking maneuvers. That big yellow dustbin from the trailer called One Off actually matches their aesthetic well, hoovering up junk to turn into bombs. And you can throw debilitating spores from the mushroom humanoid Lark. We suppose he's named that because he's a fun guy to be around. Why are you booing? Now, we guarantee more of you sighed at that joke than actually played Concord. Credit is also due for the incredibly polished cinematic cutscenes, which looked visually stunning. Unfortunately, this is where the compliments stop, because even these positives come with massive caveats. The cutscenes looked good, yes, but the characters lacked any substance, and a weekly drip feed of narrative with incoming cinematics due to expand on the characters and lore was a weird move for this kind of game. Who even asked for this? While the gunplay was well crafted, everything shaped around it felt rushed, misguided, or just plain wrong. Maps were functional enough in layout, with all the choke points, lanes, and firing angles you'd expect, but most were generic, lacking any sort of visual flair or identity, quite the feat for a vibrant sci-fi setting. Same story for the game modes, just being standard retreads of the usual. Team Deathmatch, a kill-confirmed-like mode, a few flavors of objective capture, and bomb planting and defusal. It lacked a definitive, unique mode that was proudly Concord. While a few character builds stood out, many were uninspired or felt like cheap copies of the more popular hero shooters. Teo is basically Overwatch's Soldier 76, aka Default Gun Guy. Vale the Sniper has a really big jump, and Starchild is just a shotgun-toting Drax with a Reinhardt melee. Most of this cast kind of fit into your vague archetypes like tanks, healers, DPS, etc., but weirdly they avoided making anyone feel too specialist, as most operatives had a decent form of damage output. Now in theory, this allows for versatility and avoids any one hero becoming too redundant in certain situations, but in practice this means that synergies and teamworks were less incentivized because everyone could do a bit of everything. Also worth noting is the lack of ultimates, clearly a design choice to maintain balance, but the downside is you lose those exciting match-changing plays that define the genre. The convoluted team-picking system restricted repeat picks of the same hero, not only irritating but also going against the fabric of getting good with particular heroes, developing a fondness for your so-called mains. And yet, there's the equally confusing passive mechanic, buffing stats like reload speed or damage resistance stacked only onto heroes in later rounds so you'd be encouraged to pick optimal lineup orders, completely undoing the mix-and-match experimentation that the no duplicates rules seemingly encouraged. Every feature felt at odds with one another, rather than complementary parts of a greater whole. Even long-term progression and grinding for cosmetics was needlessly confusing and only offered slightly different variants of the same hero, once again undoing the push for team variety anyway. And since we're on the subject of cosmetics, let's address another controversial point: art and character design. A key component for any hero shooter is a compelling, exciting roster of heroes. Sounds obvious, right? Well, not for Concord. Now before we go further, let's clarify something. Plenty has been said by a certain crowd of copy-paste outrage merchants, many fueled by thinly masked bigotry and tedious culture wars, and we're not giving the time of day to anyone getting upset simply because there aren't enough generic white males or barely clothed supermodels. We know this show is literally called What Went Wrong, but there's a difference between valid criticism and pointless hate-mongering. Great, now that that's covered, we believe there is still a reasonable discussion to have about character design here, and the reality is a bit more nuanced than a controversial one-sentence headline. When done right, characters in a hero shooter should add personality. They should convey their identity and background at a glance, especially in a multiplayer environment that doesn't normally have the luxury of million-dollar cutscenes. And for gameplay purposes, you should instantly get a feel for what that character is about, what powers, weapons, and general playstyle they offer. In these instances, Concord's roster falls short time and time again. Yes, they're often colourful and full of whimsy, but that's not enough for an effective character design. Many heroes lack any visual cohesion, with flat or muted tones, outfits that don't match their role, or features that feel visually unbalanced. There is some great, legitimate analysis out there from actual professionals in the field, and we won't pretend to be experts in character art, but equally, most casual players can tell if something seems off, even without the theory to back it up. But it's not just a matter of art direction, it's a matter of gameplay clarity. Clearly and instantly recognizing who's shooting at you across an explosion-filled battleground is vital, so you know who and what you're dealing with and how to counter that effectively. Admittedly, with enough time, you'll be familiar, but the best shooters give the important clues up front immediately. Let's look at some comparisons. Here is It's, the agile Concordian from earlier with the bouncing teleporty balls. A super fun and unique power, yet her design is kind of, well, plain. The only thing communicated here is quirky alien lady without any hint to her magical prowess. For a similarly tricksy, movement-focused character, look at Wraith from Apex Legends. You get an idea for her whole gimmick at a glance: all black stealthy getup, magically inclined, quick and nimble, dark emo vibes that would make for a perfect foil for It's in an odd couple sitcom. I'd watch it. How about a standard archetype, the healer? Dor is one of Concord's medical experts, but you wouldn't really know it. That coat could be a bomb disposal jacket, electrical insulation, or just this season's trendy winter warmer. The other Healy boy, Jabali, looks more like a gunslinger or sharpshooter type with that hat and goggles combo. By comparison, here's Sage from Valorant. Maybe not obviously a healer, but has a distinct support role vibe at least. And now Lifeline from Apex Legends. The robot is a mystery to newcomers, but the big trousers suggest a lot of support equipment, and she's also rocking what's clearly a medical IV bag. Or if you want to be blatantly obvious, Mercy from Overwatch is literally an angel-like figure built around healing and reviving allies, and for the classic Team Fortress 2, the medic is, well, literally a medic. There's a red cross on his doctor's coat, for goodness sake, even if the evil scientist energy he's giving off would make us think twice about booking a GP appointment. On that note, names are important too. For example, Valorant's Phoenix implies some fairly fiery shenanigans. Concord's own professional pyro, Haymar, might as well work in HR. It's a hero shooter. You're allowed to be cheesy and on the nose with these things, that's the point. Yes, we know this genre frequently offers up character skins that drastically alter appearance, so these complaints might seem uncharitable, but you have to start from a good baseline. Another key point is the general profiles and outlines of Concord's crewmates. When viewed as silhouettes, many have softer outlines and no clear characteristics, which hinders that instant recognition further in the heat of battle. You don't have to have enough pointy bits to make a Gundam jealous, but you do need some kind of instant visual identifier. Now, we're not saying the art team didn't put in the effort, but once again, the end result feels disjointed, lacking clear direction and coordination from the top. Ultimately, most heroes just lack that spark, and we doubt anyone wanted to create fan art or fan fiction of any of the characters here, which might just be the most damning criticism so far. Yes, it's time to address that price tag now, the one that says $100 million, now it's $400 million. For a while, this number seemed to rise every week. The now widely established story came from ex-IGN reporter Colin Moriarty, revealing on his podcast that, per his inside contact, the total cost was around $400 million. Firewalk Studios had allegedly spent around $200 million before Sony's acquisition, with previous owners Probably Monsters likely footing the bill. Then, a further $200 million later spent by Sony to help it over the line. So, $400 million total, but $200 million from Sony. Unless you count the cost of buying Firewalk themselves, and we're sure Probably Monsters wanted to recoup their losses, so it could have been $400 million for Sony anyway. This figure meant Concord was the single most expensive first-party release from Sony so far, which makes the game's flop even more unbelievable. By comparison, Horizon Forbidden West and The Last of Us Part 2 cost $200 million each, as per the leaks from last year. Big money, but relatively safe bets given Sony's first-party pedigree, but they played double or nothing with Concord and left with nothing. We'd still urge you to take these figures with a grain of salt, of course. Insane budgets have basically been normalized in modern AAA development, plus we don't know the portion of that budget which went to marketing, or indeed how much went exclusively to polishing the high-resolution hot sauce in the game's weekly cutscenes. Which speaks to another issue: mismanagement and misplaced priorities. Another alleged figure thrown around a lot is the 8 years of development time for Concord. Again, we'll stress that this predates Firewalk Studios entirely, who started up in 2018, so the 2 prior years likely involved early pre-production concepts at best, and likely carried on in pre-production for a few years after. According to that insider source from Colin Moriarty, the title was in a disastrous state as recently as 18 months before release, still yet to begin monetization plans or player onboarding at that point. The general atmosphere at the studio was apparently one of toxic positivity, ironically enough. They simply weren't allowed to say anything internally, shutting down any constructive criticism or valid concerns. While it's a nice change of pace for this series of videos to see a studio's culture being too positive, that blind faith, head in the sand approach is still a massive hindrance to producing a high-quality end product, never mind a massive creative project from well over 100 people. This could go a long way to explaining how many features ended up feeling conflicted, convoluted, or just bang average. This was apparently the pet project of now Sony co-CEO Herman Hulst, and higher-ups had high hopes for the franchise, seeing it as the future of PlayStation, even a potential Star Wars-like project. But with all this stargazing, they forgot to do the basic groundwork. Firstly, do people want a new hero shooter in 2024? If Concord was conceived in 2016 during the height of hero shooters, they failed to adapt or cater for a changing market, with no game-changing twist to push the genre forward. Just look at Deadlock, Valve's recent hero shooter twist on the MOBA formula. It's not even officially out yet, but it's doing numbers Concord can now only dream of, proving that there can be an appetite for the genre so long as it brings something new to the table. This speaks to a wider problem in the industry of AAA budgets inflating so far beyond reason. Every single underperforming title becomes a devastating blow, and thousands of hardworking developers are the ones paying the price, rather than the leaders responsible for those poor decisions. Concord was always going to be a huge monetary risk, chasing not just the live service dream, but also the hero shooter model. Sony struck gold with Helldivers 2, but this was in spite of it having a live service framework, not because of it. To hope for similar results in Concord when they are fundamentally different types of game was naive at best and reckless at worst. Same goes for the price point. Just because one of them sold gangbusters for $40 doesn't mean that price is right for the other. One is a co-op PvE shooter with a unique, ever-evolving landscape, and the other is a recycled premium PvP shooter with a lot of free-to-play competitors. You have Valorant, Overwatch 2, Apex Legends just for direct genre comparisons, and further afield there's Counter-Strike, PUBG, Destiny 2, and Fortnite, all completely free-to-play. And that's the simplest but arguably biggest reason for Concord's failure. Even if the game was perfection personified, why pay $40 when you can get plenty of quality for absolutely free? They priced themselves out of development and priced themselves out of the market too. From an IP dreaming of superstardom to being comprehensively ignored and shut down after just 2 weeks, never has a game felt more dead on arrival than Concord. But the story doesn't quite end there. Multiple Steam updates after the shutdown led some to speculate about a potential comeback, but sadly, there'll be no redemption arc for Concord, as on the 29th of October, Sony announced they were shutting down developers Firewalk Studios with over 150 people losing their jobs. As always, needless casualties that paid the price for mismanagement at the top. In one final sick, twisted joke, the proposed Concord-verse would get one last encore, featuring posthumously in Amazon's new animated show Secret Level, the anthology of gaming stories from the minds behind Love, Death and Robots, likely streaming now. As for the game, Sony president Hiroki Totoki lamented the fate of Concord during a recent earnings call, saying they had to take lessons from the experience, including more rigorous and frequent internal checks and user testing. We'd certainly agree with him there, but let's recap exactly what led to Concord's crash landing. The concept of Concord began in 2016, but during 8 years of development, the studio couldn't adapt to the declining audience hype for both hero shooters and live services, failing to create a unique spin on tired genres. A workplace culture of toxic positivity probably didn't help, and without any constructive criticism and improvement, bad ideas were left to fester and priorities were misplaced. From the high-fidelity weekly cinematics that didn't serve much purpose in a PvP shooter to inconsistent hero design and uninspiring or confusing systems, everything felt disjointed and the project's budget ballooned out of control. When Sony bought up the IP, their live service obsession further blinded them to the shortfalls of this overproduced mess. With very little marketing and a confusing reveal, hype was already dangerously low, and the final kicker of charging $40 in a field where free-to-play was king meant this mishmash of mediocrity was doomed from the start. An embarrassingly low player count sealed the deal, with Sony shutting down the game, the studio, and any hopes at redemption for this $400 million flop. Maybe this fate would have been understandable had the game been irredeemably bad, but that's the crazy thing. Concord wasn't disastrously terrible, just painfully mediocre and largely forgettable. As usual, the blame seems to have emanated from the top. It was a fool's errand creating an unholy union of live service and hero shooter when the gaming audience were either growing tired of both or were already locked into existing games that did them well. In the end, Concord paid the price, mainly because nobody else was willing to.